Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. I'm Philip Ideson, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement, advisor to procurement leaders around the world, and the founder and managing director of Art of Procurement. My team and I work with our global network of subject matter experts to help companies elevate procurement's impact, whether that's through building and implementing transformation programs, sustainably reducing external expenses, or leveraging AOP Mastermind, our learning and development platform for companies of all sizes. You're listening to our flagship podcast, where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their results with the needs of the business. Hi there, everybody, and welcome to today's Art of Procurement podcast. And with this being the first episode of the month, here we are in June already, I'm joined, as always, by Kelly Barner. Kelly is owner and managing director of Buyers Meeting Point and also general manager here at Art of Procurement. So, Kelly, as ever, thank you very much for joining me.
You're welcome, Phil. I'm glad to be back.
Yeah, and so as I mentioned, beginning of June, what's on your mind?
Well, I think the interesting thing is we're starting to maybe see the light at the end of the tunnel. You know, we had the hard and fast shutdown, and now states and countries and industries are starting to loosen some of the requirements. And ironically, what we're actually finding out is that in some ways, it's much easier to do a full hard shutdown than it is to do a responsibly managed and gradual reopen. So we're sort of moving on to figuring out what's next.
Yeah, and figuring out what the impact is of
That's right.
as we start to reopen, what the numbers look like, and I think there's still that unknown of what happens next. But at least we're heading in the right direction. Now, from my perspective, there was something interesting I saw actually just this morning as I was preparing for today's podcast, and that was a story in the SIPS' supply management website. It was talking about Rolls-Royce and how they were asking for between 5 and 15% savings from suppliers. And I think the article stated that it was to help Rolls-Royce remain competitive. And I don't want to go after Rolls-Royce particularly because there's a number of organizations right now, I think, around the world who are searching for some savings and some pretty quick savings. I guess where my concern is, and this is what the article doesn't state, is this an arbitrary request? So are the letters going out that say, hey, we want you to give us 5 to 15% in immediate cost reduction? Or is it, hey, we really need to all look at ways we can bring costs down. Let's find a collaborative way like value analysis, value engineering as an example, as a way to do that. I think that if it's the latter, that's really promising for the role that procurement can play in helping our companies get over these hurdles. If it's the former, where it's just a blanket letter, I've been in organizations, unfortunately, before that have done that. And it doesn't do, it might help you a little bit, in the next 3 months, but it's going to do a lot of damage to your supplier relationships.
No, absolutely. And that's an area where procurement has invested so much in terms of trying to improve the relationships that we have with our suppliers, because we want that value focus. Yes, right now we need to manage costs and address expenses, but if we don't keep an eye on the fact that that relationship needs to survive, we're certainly doing ourselves a disservice in the short term.
Right. And I think that ties in a little bit with today's conversation. So you and I both just finished speaking with Joe Lazzerini. Joe is a consultant at Corcentric, and he has expertise specifically in the logistics category. Now, Corcentric are a leading provider of procurement and finance solutions that really help companies transform how they purchase, pay, and get paid. And they're also members of the Art of Procurement Experts on Demand network, and they sponsor this once a month Ask the Expert service. I want to thank Corcentric for doing that. Now, the conversation that we had with Joe, you and I discussed the current state of the logistics categories and how organizations should actually be looking at mapping out the next 6 months or so to remain agile to all the different potential circumstances. It's a category that's really been impacted both on the increasing demand in some areas and decreasing demand in others. So interesting dynamics at work in the logistics category. So really looking forward to sharing that interview with you. Now, as we go into the conversation with Joe, the first question that I often ask our guests is, did you find procurement or did procurement find you?
I would say that procurement found me. I had spent quite a bit of time bouncing around in career opportunities, anything in the operations world to HR to project management,
Mm-hmm.
and then started to get into the purchasing side of things in a manufacturing setting. But it wasn't until that I moved into a strictly logistics consulting environment.
Yeah.
Came in as actually as an administrative assistant to the head of sales. But what that really did was it introduced me to the world of consulting and introduced me to the world of logistics. And after several years in that industry, I was able to take that knowledge that I learned and apply it to a little bit more of a broader procurement setting. So taking the knowledge that I learned in the logistics realm, was able to take that and use other knowledge bases that I had. So whether it be the purchasing
Mm-hmm.
side of things or project management, and roll that into kind of a more general philosophy when it comes to procurement and the overall industry.
Yeah. Now, I want to actually dig deeper into logistics today. It was really what we picked as the category for this month for this Ask the Expert series, because I think it's a category that, with everything that's going on right now in the world, has been particularly, I don't want to say use the word badly, but just it's been hit. Lots of changes in the category, and so I guess my first question from that side would be, given where you sit, the perspective that you have across different modes of transportation within logistics, where are we right now? Where are the pain points? Where are the opportunities? Like, what's the general state of the market?
So, I mean, to say where it's at right now, I mean, it kind of helps to understand, or just to kind of remember kind of where we were in logistics over the course of, whether it be, let's just chop off the last 2 or 3 years and just
Yeah.
go for the 5 years, 10 years, 20 years before that. A lot of what you would hear from people is that, they're doing things a certain way just because that's how they've always done it. And now, while there might have been a few instances here and there where there were some blips in the logistics network or supply chain global network, there weren't too many things out there that were doing, big, massive global effects on logistics and supply chains. So it was easier for companies that might just be, maybe somewhat decentralized, or a couple of facilities in the Midwest or whatever have you, that they could get away with just kind of status quo year in and year out. And I think that the complacency over the course of time kind of it worked for people because, again, familiarity. You have the
Mm-hmm.
ability to really get set in your ways, you get efficient in your ways, and that can work out for a lot of people. But then when things start to change, when the COVID-19 situation that we're going through right now is obviously the hot topic on people's minds. But if you were sitting at a table, in late 2018, and you were looking at trying to negotiate an ocean contract for the up and coming
Yeah.
year, at that point in time, the ocean industry had gone through the most unprecedented time in ocean shipping that anybody could remember. And that was all because of the tariffs that went into place for China.
Mm-hmm.
So, the U.S. Imports took a hit, and you had people scrambling trying to figure out what to do. How do they get their freight out of China into the United States? And then once it gets in the United States, what can they do with it? Because if you're overloading the front end of getting your ocean containers over here, how do you have the ability to then store them? Because warehousing's at
Yeah.
a premium. Might be bringing them into different ports. Well, all that really meant was that people started really trying to think of creative ways to get their freight in. And then you had that coinciding with a little bit of a downturn in the LTL industry. It's like, okay, well, with less than truckload? Are we able to then maybe take a look at negotiating along those fronts? Well, all these sort of moving pieces that were taking place hadn't really quite settled back down again, because also in the ocean world, you had the marine fuel situation with um, the new regulations that went into place at the beginning of 2020. And so there was a lot of people bracing for a huge impact on the fuel side of things. And you didn't have a chance for anything to really settle down. And we go right into the COVID-19 situation. And so it's really been, for the last couple of years, a time where people have had a lot more unknowns in their overall network.
Mm-hmm.
Different modes. I mean, you might have a little bit more stability in one or the other, depending upon what it is that you ship and how you ship it. But ultimately, what we've been really what we're seeing is just trying to figure out ways for companies to be able to reduce reduce the risk of what's out there right now. How do you try to lock in something? How do you try to negotiate? How do you try to build a relationship? What can you do on your end that allows you to a mitigate the risk that is currently in place, but then also prepare for what is going to be coming down the road when when things start to kind of free back up again. The state of the industry right now is just a lot of question marks. Now, there are some companies within logistics that are a little bit more primed to be able to handle that kind of
Mm-hmm.
flexibility. They can chomp at the bit and say, hey, you know what? We're able to take on any sort of situation right now. We're willing to help out in any way, shape, or form. But then you have some other situations where you have a little bit more specialized network of maybe carriers or services that you use, that this is really a trying time for them as well.
Yeah.
So, it's trying to understand where that balance sits, and what can you do to position yourselves within your current supply base to be able to withstand this and work with them and become a true partner in your relationship, and not just sit there and try to figure out ways to take advantage of the whole situation, because that could end up having a larger impact down the road negatively. So that's kind of the snapshot that I've seen over the last
Mm-hmm.
several months, if not years.
Now, with all the uncertainty that you talked about, and obviously it impacts different modes in different ways, um, are you finding that the carrier? So, how? Let me rephrase that. How badly hit, generally speaking, are the shippers, the carriers? The LTL trucking companies. Are they coming to their customers with we need your help because this is really having such a tough impact on us? Or are they coming and saying, hey, capacity is restrained, or capacity is, we're doing some things here where actually we need you to make some longer term commitments because, we've got more volume than we can handle?
Variety of things. It depends on who you are as a shipper or as a
Yeah.
carrier. I'm kind of all over the place with that. We were not too far in the past looking at a situation where, like, the LTL industry, the capacity was an issue. Very limited in driver retention, so the
Mm-hmm.
industry as a whole was losing its ability to carry freight. So driver shortages was a huge issue, and that obviously then translates into capacity. If you look at the ocean industry that I just mentioned about, the tariffs and the whole fuel regulation, there wasn't a single ocean carrier that said that, and this is looking back at 2018, that they were basically operating at 99 to 100% capacity at that time.
Yeah.
There weren't too many ships that were sailing with anything empty. They were at max capacity. So we were at a very maxed out network. And the key that often gets kind of overlooked when you're looking at some of those pricing situations is that in LTL and ocean especially, you're not necessarily purchasing you're not purchasing a commodity, obviously. It's not just like you're buying nuts and bolts or paper or something
Mm-hmm.
along those lines. You're buying space within a confined area. And you have to be able to make sure that you can get your freight into that space in any way, shape, or form. So whether it just be a container and get it onto a ship, you need to be able to get it on there. How do you get it on there? Well, hopefully you were working with your supplier or your carriers in order to get um, the right pricing situation in place. So you weren't taking advantage of the situation, but they were also willing to move your freight for the right price. LTL carriers, obviously, they have a little bit more room to play at that point in time because we were actually seeing situations where carriers were deselecting clients. You know, we don't want to
Right.
necessarily move your
Hmm.
freight because we're maxed out. We can go move this company's really nice, good freight that's really easy to get to and is much more consistent in its routing and compared to somebody who might have some freight that doesn't quite fit in the back of a truck ideally. So, there was a lot of time. The last couple of years have been a really interesting time for way carriers and companies negotiate with their pricing mechanisms. And as of right now, capacity is obviously freed up a lot. There isn't as many people shipping stuff. So you could certainly use this time to reach out to your LTL carriers or full truck carriers and see what you can be doing to take advantage of that added capacity that hasn't been there in to be honest
Hmm.
with you, quite some time. With that said, if you're looking at using localized hot shot carriers or localized companies that work with freight forwarders a lot, I know here in the Chicagoland area, there are a lot of them that are beyond busy because they've just been able to move into the different sector that's busy right now. So they've been working with moving a lot of PPE, a lot of
Interesting.
different supplies that are related to the
Hmm.
COVID-19 upflux of freight that has just shifted markets. And because they're smaller and have more flexibility, they can hop on and take that freight no matter what it is. So it really has to. It really boils down to your ability to be open with your communication and how frequently you're communicating with your carriers and understanding how you can work with them more consistently and frequently on what works best for them and how that fits into your network and what can you be doing better or differently or what they can be doing better or differently to kind of make sure that the pieces of the puzzle are always working coherently.
Now, Joe, one of the things that's interesting, and I'll refer to the LTL category specifically, and anyone that's ever sourced it, I think would agree it's one of the most analytically complex and also large categories of spend that procurement tends to have an opportunity to help manage. And it's very heavily based on not only known demand by lane or location, but also the exact nature of the freight that a shipper is putting through each of those channels. And then it's run against the specific capabilities and capacity on the part of the carrier. How would you recommend that we incorporate some of those shifts? So if we have contracts currently in place, those are based on assumptions or projections or anticipated demand that now may be completely different in terms of volume, location, type of material being moved, and also things are shifting from the carrier side. How would you suggest that procurement teams be opportunistic and look at all of these moving pieces and figure out how to help this category settle while also being efficient?
So I think for what the category historically and the way that it's often been reviewed is looking at, to use the word again, historicals. So to sit there and try to come up with a mechanism as of today that says, this is what we have going on today. Well, what you're basing that on? Well, hopefully you're able to base it upon, the last 12 months worth of data that can basically build that network in a way that says, hey, listen, this is what we've shipped in the past, and this is probably what it's going to look like in the future. Well, carriers over the course of the last several years have been catching up with their ability to do their analytics. And so when you sit there and come out and say, this is what our profile looks like, and then all of a sudden it changes, they're pretty quick to throw a red
Okay.
flag up and say, hey, listen, we were anticipating X, Y, and Z, and that's not happening. So to me, and this kind of goes into a bigger theme that I think procurement as a whole tries to get behind, but something that I've been trying to kind of echo in the logistics world is really truly having a transparent relationship with that supplier. So if there are changes that are going to be happening, if you're looking at that carrier and saying, I know that we're normally shipping this lane this often with this product, but that's not going to be the case now. The
Mhm.
second that you change that commodity out, if you're if the class of that shipment is changed, so you're shipping a product that might be class 50 or 60, and now all of a sudden it's class 125, 150, that is less of an operating ratio that's advantageous for that carrier. and they will notice it right away. And so instead of trying to hide it or trying to be a little coy in the way what you start doing, immediately reach out to your carriers, try to figure out a way to negotiate something that can, it might end up actually costing you a few extra dollars within that contract to say, hey, let's put in a clause or let's change something out
Mhm.
to be able to do this, because ultimately it's a two-way street. You need to be able to have a carrier trust you in what you're doing, and they will come back and raise prices if they're not operating profitably. And so you might as well get out ahead of it and work with them in a way that what I like to always try to say is that, that over the course of time, everybody wants to negotiate down, down, down. I want to spend less on my freight, spend less on my
Yeah.
freight. At some point, you end up having to go, well, we bottomed out. We can't keep on going down anymore. These carriers need to make some money too. And
Yeah.
so, it's not the ideal thing that anybody wants to hear in procurement or wherever in finance, is that they go, oh, you mean to tell me we have to spend more next year on it? Like, you might have to. It's negotiating a lower increase potentially than what you were, what they might have hoped for. But it is a little bit of a give and take, and it's you're showing that a little bit of ability to be flexible on your end. But ultimately, what it comes down to is it's not always about having to pay the lowest price. It's about paying the right price.
Right.
And so your ability to match up your freight for the right cost that is going to be profitable for the carrier, but the lowest, but the best for you, that's the way that you're going to be able to enhance your relationships down the road with that carrier. And you might start to get a little bit more flexibility down the road, but you're not going to do that if you're lowballing and trying to hammer down, because eventually, if you want to get a carrier in there that matches your needs, that is a good carrier for you, they're just going to walk away. They're going to say, if you want cheap freight, then go to one of those
Yeah.
really cheap carriers and have at it. But we pride ourselves on being a higher quality carrier, and the advantages that we could bring to the table, like our on-time deliveries and our lack of damages to the freight, or our reliability and pickups, and our like all that stuff goes out the window if you're just sitting there trying to hammer down cost. So your ability to work with your carrier to get the right cost in place is critical, especially if you are trying to do something that is a little bit different down the road.
Now, to that point about doing things different, and obviously it's going to vary by shipper, right? But do you think that in at least some cases, the changes and the shifts and the disruptions that we've seen are significant enough that as a procurement team looking at your LTL category, or truthfully, I mean, it could be small parcel, right? Any kind of logistics, freight type category, have things been disrupted enough that we not only need to look at what will the new volume or price point be for what we've done in the past, but maybe we need a new pricing model, or maybe we need a new contract structure. When you look at the changes in your behavior as an organization and how it drives the cost in this category, what might you say are some indications that procurement needs to do more than just look at, okay, I'm going to pay a little more here and a little more there, but basically I'm doing the same thing, versus actually going back and saying, this has been a fundamental shift in terms of how we leverage this category and how it supports our operation. And we kind of need to go back to square one and restructure.
Yeah, so I think one of the key things, and where I would try to focus that conversation, is that so like if we took LTL as an example, is that it's a very antiquated pricing model for the most part. When you're looking at there's a base rate that nobody really pays. They're always discounted, and depending upon if you're on some whatever base rate you start with, then you could get discounts based on that, and it's a very again antiquated way of doing that contract. Now, is it going to change? I doubt it. I mean, you're looking at an industry
Mm,
as a whole that moves fairly slowly as it is,
yeah.
and to expect them to just all of a sudden change their pricing structure does not seem likely. When it comes to ocean freight, the pricing model is pretty simple. At the beginning of the year, there's a conference that takes place where all the major shippers in the world get together with all the major carriers in the world, and essentially they talk through what they're expecting for the next year. And the first several companies to negotiate is usually your Targets and Walmart type companies. And once they establish the cost of what it's going to take to move their containers out of China and into the United States, whether it be a standard 40-foot or 20-footer, that sets the market. And you have the cost of that container, and everybody then basically negotiates from there. So
Okay.
a lot of your ability to do the base contract may not necessarily be able to change, but I think where you could really start to do some deep dives is in the ancillary charges that come into a contract, especially where the carriers know that they can bake in margin. So a lot,
Okay.
the number one place that is often looked at would be fuel. Your ability to negotiate a fuel table in LTL, or your bath charges in ocean freight, the ability to take out a lot of the volatility within the fuel allows you to kind of be more predictable in the cost of your fuel in the future, but also you're not having to play that guessing game and if fuel goes way down, you're not being able to take advantage of it, or the carriers are really smart when it comes to the fuel, and they will bake in their margins as much as possible into the cost of the fuel. And so a
Mhm.
lot of the ways that you can be a little bit a little different in your negotiating strategy is to try to take a lot of the volatility and the instability out of the fuel cost that makes the carriers not be able to play with their margins as much. And they will end up trying to figure out a way to put a little bit more back in the cost of the freight itself. But
Okay.
essentially, what that does is that allows you to be a lot more predictable and a lot more consistent with your pricing over the course of the next 12 months, instead of sitting there saying, hey, as of March 1st, we locked in this contract and it all looks good now. But in 3 months, when the cost of fuel skyrockets, now all of a sudden this doesn't look so good. Well, if you had taken out the ability for the carriers to use that spike in fuel to their advantage, now you're going to be able to sit there and say, hey, 3 months down the road into this contract, we're still looking pretty consistent with what we expected, and allows you to be much more predictable and allow you to plan better for how your future is going to look throughout the course of that contract.
Now, there's something you said earlier, Joe, that I wanted to just jump in and reiterate. You talked about paying the right price being more important than paying the lowest price. And I always found in logistics, it's one of those categories where, folks who aren't necessarily deeply involved in the category, and this can be executives, for example, across the business, will look at I want to say generally accepted kind of media position of what's happening within a category, like, oh, oil is going down and therefore I should be able to reduce my freight charges by 50%, or oh, the world has stopped doing commerce right now and therefore there must be all this empty capacity, I'm going to reduce my cost by 75%, or whatever it is. I've come across that a
Mm-hmm.
number of times, and obviously it's so nuanced and there's so many different interconnected parts of that, which mean that rarely is that the case. And I think right now we probably have a time where a lot of folks are looking and thinking, well, there must be lots of savings to be had here because, the shippers are in trouble because less things are being moved.
Mm-hmm.
I guess what I wanted to kind of follow up and ask a question on when I think about that is, as we look forward to the next 6 months, the next 12 months, we're going to be having a lot of pressure from within our organizations to obviously reduce expenses across categories. And logistics might be one of those areas that, when a programmatic approach is taken to expense reduction, logistics is targeted as an area to focus on.
Mm-hmm.
How can we as procurement professionals react to that? Given the realities of the market versus perhaps what the needs of our business are, then those two things might be different. And should we be looking at starting to bring all this to market and running RFPs right now, or should our focus be on, let's make sure that we maintain and strengthen the relationships we have, so at least we get the capacity when we need it?
Sure, and that's kind of one of the fairly consistent kind of communication gaps that needs to be really wide open when it comes to any sort of project that start taking on when companies start talking about saving money. So procurement will look at that as the industry is telling me that cost is going down, we should be saving money. The logistics folks are saying, pump the brakes, it's not that easy. And so
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times in a consulting role, and this is where we often are put into the middle of that conversation. It's the money is part of the conversation. Obviously, we want to be able to do the best we can in the logistics world if you're working for a company to save as much money as possible. But you can't do that with giving away other areas within that business. So if you just sit there and you say, all right, well, this carrier is doing X, Y, and Z for me at this cost. And you go, all right, well, we should be able to reduce that cost with that carrier. The carrier is going to sit there and go, like, okay, why? Like, what's in it for me? And they go,
Yeah.
well, my business. I mean, you want to be able to carry our freight, don't you? And they go, well, yeah, but we could go get other freight. I mean, the industry is going to be had. Everybody's going to be looking for their freight to get moved. And when we get all ramped up, if we're using this COVID-19 as the example, they just be like, you know what, if you're going to keep lowballing, then we're just going to go someplace else. There's all sorts of freight to be taken. And so you sit there and you go, all right, well, now what? Well, you can maybe find another carrier that can do that for you. But maybe that other carrier was always willing to come in for late pickup times at 6 o'clock, and which allowed you to get an extra 20% of freight out the door that day. Whereas the other carriers, they have a strict cutoff time because of where their distribution center is at 4 o'clock. Well, you lost 2 hours of loading for that day. Like, all right, well, didn't really think about that. You maybe find out that other carrier has an extra day of transit time to one of your largest clients. So one of your sales reps now says, hey, company ABC was usually getting their product in 3 days. Now it's taking 4. What's up with that? Well, didn't really think about that. So there are so many other pieces to the puzzle when it comes to logistics that just simply thinking, oh, the industry's telling me I should save money.
Yeah.
Let's go out and hammer our carriers and try to reduce our costs. It doesn't necessarily work that way. FedEx and UPS, if you look at parcel, and I know we haven't really talked much about parcel, but FedEx and UPS or FedEx and UPS, you don't really have a whole lot of room to negotiate with them. They know what they're doing. You could generally try to get something, but a lot of times what you end up doing with them is if you're able to buy into a bigger market. So if you're able to join some sort of group purchasing organization situation where now your $2 million worth of spend gets pooled in with another $50 million worth of spend. Okay, now you have a little bit of negotiation with those companies. But $100,000 to UPS, I mean that's a contract that they'll take it. If you start getting into the couple million,
it's like you going to the post office and buying a few stamps.
Yeah,
and expecting you're going to be able to negotiate a discount.
Exactly. I mean, they obviously want the business, but at the same time, they're not going to sit there and bend over backwards to get it. I think that if you're talking millions of dollars or tens of millions, they will definitely listen. But ultimately, the reason why they're listening is because they just know that if they don't have it, their competitors getting it, and they see it right through that. They go, well, if we're not going to get it, like in the LTL. If a carrier goes, well, we're not getting that business, they don't know. It could be 20 other companies that are getting it. UPS ain't getting it. They know FedEx
They're just giving the revenue
vice
back.
Versa.
Yeah,
exactly. So it's a little bit of a different situation with them. But in the trucking world, I think that there are ways that you can look at that and say, all right, well, if we were to, moving forward here, let's get a carrier in the door and say, what's your capacity looking like? Knowing our network, knowing how we've been doing business, knowing how you're at right now because of the coming out of this pandemic, what can we be doing to help be more efficient in what we're doing? How can we work with you to be able to make sure that we're doing everything on our end possible to make their life easier? And if that means then you can come to the table and negotiate a pricing change, then so be it. But put it on yourself first to work with them in a way and say, we want you around. We want you to be our carrier. We want to do things by right with you. What can we do to help? And if they sit there and say, well, as it turns out, we actually had a lot of capacity open up in this area, and we noticed that you guys use a different carrier in that area heavily because we were at the time it didn't work out. You sit there and say, all right, well, we could start looking at that now. You could maybe say in the Southwest now we were using a different carrier, but you have capacity now. Let's look at that and be flexible with those conversations and don't just say the industry's telling me one thing. I should be able to go negotiate this in a way that is going to be able to save me a bunch of money, because the carriers are just not going to respond to that these days. They want the business, but they also have a lot of other companies out there wanting to put their freight in the back of those trucks. So you need to be able to be flexible in how you approach them and willing to work with them to make sure that your freight is getting in the back of that truck.
So what you're really saying here, Joe, is that, we talk in procurement about being a customer of choice. So in this case, specifically, it's a shipper of choice. And there's probably a lot of companies right now that are suddenly discovering that they are not a shipper of choice, whether it's because it's something about the way they operate now or some way that they've interacted with the carrier in the past. So if you are suddenly finding out because of rate hikes, poor information, or simply no capacity that you can find where you need it, and you're discovering that something about your model has not made you a shipper of choice, does it make the different kinds of freight categories a key opportunity for a more relationship management oriented mode, even though we are trying to address that savings and expense reduction need that our organization has? This may be a huge challenge for procurement to really start putting into place some of those things that we've talked about, in some cases with more action than others, around being relationship oriented and transparent, as you said, and collaborating with these carriers to make sure that we're not inadvertently either putting waste or cost or inefficiency into the system.
Exactly, and I think that that's kind of the key here is, in a time where maybe you're not shipping as much as you were, utilizing this gap in production or gap in client purchasing or whatever the case may be, to work with carriers in a way that allows you to um, be that, to call it the shipper of choice. They want your business. So if you're just constantly throwing loose stuff on the back of a pallet, slapping it in the back of their truck, and sliding all over the place, obviously that doesn't fly, and they will eventually say something. But I mean, that's kind of an extreme example. But you could use something like that. Invite the carrier in, invite your carrier rep in and say, hey, listen, this is the back of our warehouse, or this is the back of our distribution center. Anything that you would suggest that we change? Something that could be, dimensions and a weight machine that's able to be much more accurate when it comes to that stuff. So a dimensionalizer. So now you're not having to have the carrier reclass a shipment because you said it was one thing, and then when they get the bill of lading, it's something different. You can sit there and maybe invest in that at this point in time. Now it's hard to sit there and in a time where money might be tight, justifying the concept of spend money to save money could be a little bit difficult. But if you can really show that return on investment and work with a carrier on having them provide a lot of that information for you as well, I think that they have such a connection to the entire state of the industry that don't be afraid to lean on them for some of this information. Work with them, talk with them, ask them for what they've seen from other companies. What can you do to be more efficient in how you ship? And it could be, again, as simple as just tidying up the way that your freight is on the back of a truck, but also you can look at ways of changing your design in your organization of the back of your warehouse where freight's going out the door. Are there ways that you can make your team more efficient? And again, if you're able to get out 100 pallets a day, and you can do some things efficiently in the back of the warehouse that makes it so you can get out 120. I mean, it all adds up. It changes the formula. It allows you to be more efficient in the way that you do things. It allows the carriers to get a little bit more business more steadily. Maybe you can work with them on the routing, and they can sit there and you're more predictable at that point. You can look at this whole piece of the puzzle and say, these are the things that we would like to try to improve on, and they can help you improve on those things. And it's stuff that's hard to do when you're slammed every day and you just got orders going out the door and everybody's just trying to frantically figure out ways to survive in the day-to-day grind of the business. And if you have this opportunity where there's some gap in your time, you can really take advantage of your ability to build up your supplier relationships, organize and optimize your warehouse and what you can do on that end of it. You can look at other ways of how you can maybe really, well, automation is obviously another huge piece of that whole efficiency side of things. So anywhere that you could put in automation, whether it be at the warehouse level or the ordering level. You could even use this time that if you want to research alternative options for warehousing or distribution centers, where your import options are. Maybe everything that you ship has always come in from China and come into the U.S. West Coast, so it's always coming to LA Long Beach. Is this an opportunity to take a look at moving your operation to Vietnam, or is it an opportunity to look at importing it to the East Coast and coming in via maybe Norfolk and having a little bit of a longer trucking timeline, but you maybe reduce the bottleneck at LA Long Beach, and it ends up being kind of a wash, but you could do it for $100 per container cheaper. Take this time to figure that kind of stuff out.
Yeah.
Look at different options. Is your distribution center in Texas the most efficient? Could it move to Georgia and be better? Even it might cost a little bit more, but it's going to be cost less in your daily runs of LTL. Like, analyze it all, work with your carriers, ask questions, and really start to dig into all this stuff. And that's how you're going to be able to save money on the back end, not just by hammering every single carrier saying, right, I need a reduction in cost because I know the market's down. That's just not that's just not the way we try to do business.
It's an opportunity to really optimize your entire supply chain.
Exactly. I mean,
that's where may have been missed before or forgotten about before.
Yeah, and that's where companies have to start looking now, because again, it was hammering carriers over and over and over again on lowering costs. Well, the carriers are getting smart now. I mean, getting smart. They've been getting smart for years now, but they've become much more in tune to what you're trying to do, and they understand it. So at some point, you max that out. You basically you've done all you can with just negotiating your costs down. Now it's on you to work with that carrier and become much more efficient in how you do your operation, and use that as your tool to reduce your cost.
Well, Joe, I want to really thank you so much. There's so many insights that you provided for listeners related to the logistics category, really across all different modes. Obviously, it's an interesting time within the logistics space right now, and it's one that I'm sure a month or two from now may even look different than what it looks today. Here we are at the very end of May, beginning of June. But I want to thank you for sharing with us what you are seeing. And just my last question is, if listeners would like to connect with you directly, where would be the best place for them to find you?
You can directly contact me via LinkedIn. You can just search my name of Joe Lazzerini, Lazzerini. And then as a company as a whole, Corcentric.com, Corcentric.com. There's a lot of good resources that we have available for download at our website. You can look into some of the topics that I've mentioned today further. And then if you also would like to look at a company blog along with a procurement and specifically logistics blog that I have put up, you can go to strategicsorcerer.com and you can search logistics, and a lot of my stuff will come up. And then we have a lot of really other good content specific to procurement on that website as well.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend anyone who hasn't checked out strategicsorcerer.com to do so. And what I'll do is I'll include links to the blog, to your LinkedIn profile, to the company page, all on our show notes page for today's episode. So if listeners just go to artofprocurement.com/podcast, that's where today's podcast and all the other podcasts that we have on the show will be featured. Click on today's episode and you'll get all the links there. So that's artofprocurement.com/podcast. Joe, one last time, I just want to thank you so much for joining Kelly and I today. I want to thank you for listening in to Kelly and I's conversation today with Joe. And the big takeaway that I want to highlight is the importance of building supplier of choice relationships with any supplier upon which you rely, and in this case, with your shipping company. So it's easy to fall into a trap where you're looking at categories with multiple sources of supply and thinking that they're falling into a commoditized bucket. But the reality is that across all the categories that you have, if you want to work with the best suppliers, you have to invest in a two-way relationship rather than rely on that often unspoken threat of walking away from the business. Now, to subscribe to our weekly newsletter, the AOP Insider, and never miss an episode of the podcast, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe, and you can find our back catalogue of 322 podcasts from the past 5 years at artofprocurement.com/podcast.